Now that we've looked at how our self-concept forms, basically, we can look at some characteristics. And the one thing that the book focuses on is how the self-concept is subjective. Now, what we want to point out here is that we can have a distorted view of our self-concept. We may not have one that is accurate. And this distortion can be positive or negative. And here are several ways that distorted self-evaluations like these can happen. And so the more you become aware of these, the more that you can say, oh, I see what I'm doing, and you can correct that behavior, the view that you're using to evaluate your self-concept. So the first one we want to look at is obsolete information. Now, the word obsolete means outdated. So with obsolete information, you need to understand that whatever you have done in the past, that does not necessarily mean it's what you'll do or how you'll behave now. So whether it's past failures in relationships, past failures in school, past failures in a job, they can, because they can linger in our minds, sometimes we might fall prey to this. But remember that you don't need to judge your self-concept based on past successes or failures. Successes don't guarantee that you'll be successful in the future. And the same goes for failures. That doesn't mean you're going to continue to fail. So if you struggled with math, for example, in high school, that doesn't mean that you have to continue to struggle in the future. So if you're not careful, it actually becomes what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy, which we'll be looking at uh, um, in this chapter. So obsolete means it's out of date. So that means when we're doing the Plickers, to make sure that you're thinking about, is there some mention in the example that talks about how the past is being used to make a judgment for the present or future, the way someone is looking at it. Distorted feedback is specifically the remarks of people that would affect you. Overly critical parents, as the book says, cruel friends, uncaring teachers, excessively demanding employers, even strangers could leave a memorable and negative impact on you, or one that would be overly positive, because that is one that we need to remember. One aspect of this is that distorted messages or distorted feedback can be negative, unrealistically negative and distorted, or it can be distorted in an unrealistically positive way. So a child can have an inflated ego because they're constantly told how well they're doing. They get lots of praise, even though they are not. So it's a something that our culture has dealt with some. If you might recall that everybody gets a trophy, that there is, if you want children to have the goal to reach, right, that you can't say they have arrived if they haven't arrived yet. So and this is probably, it depends on the age of the children, I would think, but that's something we discuss in class. So also, the example of a boss's inflated ego might come from praise from brown-nosing subordinates. So people constantly, oh, you're doing such a great job. Oh, you're wonderful, and give constant praise if they don't actually, if it isn't true, all right, then it can cause problems. So, and that person is going to have a distorted sense of their self-concept. Now, these last two kind of go together. They're opposite sides of a coin. And these specifically have to do, in this context of communication, it specifically has to do with the idea of perfectionism and social expectations within the context of what our society or culture tells us our self-concept should be. So, in other words, or how we should behave. So perfectionism we're exposed to from very early on. Again, the book says as soon as we learn to understand language, and the implied message, implied, so it's not necessarily something directly told to a child, but the implied message is that a well-adjusted, successful person has no faults. So in other words, if you have not, that's what you have to attain, is to be a perfectly well-adjusted person. That means you will be successful in everything you try to do. So we know that's false, because no human being is perfect. I mean, we are not perfect people. All right. So but it's a distortion to be told in this implied way that there is a perfection that we're supposed to keep trying to reach. So obviously we're going to feel like failures if we believe and we buy into this idea of perfectionism. So social expectations, right? And the book points out how this is strange. Right? It's curious that this perfectionist society, who says you're supposed to become perfect, that's the goal. And of course, we know no one can reach that. So that you also cannot, we cannot talk about our strengths, our successes, that we're supposed to downplay those strengths that we do possess, because we don't want to look down on others, in other words. So we label those who do honestly appreciate their own strengths to be braggarts or egotists, or maybe even narcissists, right? Confusing them with the people who boast about accomplishments that they have not succeeded in, that they don't possess those successes. So this leads us to freely talk about our shortcomings, but we have to downplay our accomplishments or successes. And so it's really is a pretty strong opposing concepts, this idea of perfectionism, which our society says, or you're supposed to reach perfection. That's the goal. If you don't reach that and become a perfect person, a well-adjusted, successful person with no faults, then you have failed. All right. So that's obviously not a rational concept to believe in. So, and then social expectations, we're supposed to not talk about those. We're not supposed to, because it looks like bragging, right? But we should be able to honestly pat ourselves in the back and not look down at people and say, here's something that I did to be able to succeed in this. This might be something that will work for you. That's okay to say, right? So if you had a group of students and they're waiting for the instructor to give some instructions for a group assignment, and they're all in small groups, and so they just start talking about the last exam they had, and let's say one person made an A and one person made a C. In other words, person failed the course. We'll just say there's 3 in the group. So the person that made the A, according to this idea of social expectations, is if that student was to say, that they got this A and all that, then it might be uncomfortable, and probably that person will refrain from bringing it up, because of this expectation that you're not supposed to do that, so but it's really in the way that you communicate it. Usually I've seen this kind of thing happen, and I've seen students ask other students, well, what did you get? And they would honestly tell them, but they usually would also say, this is what I did, or the students would know. The students would just know because they knew the person worked hard. So in that case, that works. But a lot of times people would rather, like, oh yeah, maybe, yeah, well, I know I did okay on this one, but in this other class, I got a D. So downplay the strengths and play up the failures, which is the complete opposite of perfectionism. So those are the four concepts that we're going to be looking for in clickers. And then the only other thing to kind of add right now would be the idea that we're not going to go into cultural aspects yet, would be the idea of cognitive conservatism. And I'll bring this up again in class, but cognitive conservatism is, right, the tendency to seek and attend to information that's only going to conform with your already stable self-concept, right? Because we don't want to change it. That it's because of that stability, we're just resistant to change. We're resistant to change, and that can be a positive or negative. So in other words, if you have an overinflatedly positive sense of self, then it may be hard to see the negative things. If your self-concept has too much negative in it that you see, it may be difficult to see the positive. But we definitely all have attributes that, whether it's based on personality, whether it's based on our environment and how we were raised and all kinds of other things in our past experience, even though that exists, that it's just best that we recognize that we all have faults and we all have strengths, and we all want to grow in ourselves. So, and while the self-concept is resistant to change and it's difficult to change, it can be changed. So I'm going to leave you with that, and we'll be continuing with this next week. Thank you.